Picture this. A 17-year-old walks through the doors of Lincoln Valley High School on a Tuesday morning in October wearing a simple gray hoodie and carrying a worn backpack that's seen better days. To everyone watching, he looks like easy prey, quiet average height, keeping his head down as he navigates the crowded hallways. What they don't see is the calloused knuckles hidden beneath his sleeves, the disciplined posture of someone who's spent years training his body into a weapon, or the steel-cold focus behind those seemingly nervous eyes. What they're about to discover is that some people's greatest strength lies not in what they show the world, but in what they choose to keep hidden until the moment they absolutely have to reveal it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves as Chen stepped out of his mother's silver Honda Civic, his stomach churning with a familiar mixture of dread and resignation. This was his fourth school in 3 years, another fresh start that would inevitably become another battleground. His mother, Dr. Chen, squeezed his shoulder gently from the driver's seat, her dark eyes reflecting the same worry that had become a constant companion in their household. "Remember what we talked about," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of too many similar conversations. "Keep your head down, focus on your studies, and stay out of trouble." Marcus nodded, shouldering his backpack with practiced efficiency. The irony wasn't lost on him that his mother, a respected emergency room physician who saved lives for a living, was asking her son to become invisible. But after what had happened at Riverside Academy, after the incident that had forced them to pack up their lives once again, they both understood the necessity of blending in. Lincoln Valley High School loomed before him like a fortress of red brick and glass, its sprawling campus housing nearly 3,000 students from the affluent suburbs of Northern California. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns, where clusters of teenagers gathered in their predetermined social hierarchies. Marcus had learned to read these groupings like a survival guide over the years. The athletes dominated the central courtyard, their letter jackets and confident postures marking them as the apex predators of the teenage ecosystem. The arts kids claimed the steps near the theater building, their creative energy buzzing with morning conversations about upcoming productions and gallery showings. The academic elite huddled near the library entrance, comparing notes and discussing weekend study sessions with the intensity of military strategists. And then there were the others, the ones Marcus instinctively identified as his people. The quiet kids who walked alone, the transfer students still searching for their place, the ones who had learned that sometimes survival meant becoming a ghost in plain sight. These were the invisible ones, the students who had mastered the art of moving through high school without drawing attention to themselves. Marcus had been practicing this particular skill for most of his teenage years. As he walked toward the main entrance, Marcus caught fragments of conversation that painted a picture of Lincoln Valley's social landscape. Two girls discussed weekend plans that involved parties he would never be invited to. A group of boys debated the previous Friday's football game with the passion of professional analysts. Teachers hurried past with coffee cups and stacks of papers, their faces already showing the strain of another Tuesday morning in paradise. The administrative office buzzed with the controlled chaos that Marcus had come to associate with school bureaucracy. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sterile glow that made the beige walls seem even more institutional. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, handed him his class schedule and a campus map with the practiced efficiency of someone who had guided countless new students through this same routine. Chen, she read from his file, pronouncing his last name with careful precision. Transfer from Riverside Academy. You'll be starting with first period American history with Mr. Patterson. Room 142 is just down the main hallway. Second, door on your left. She pointed toward the corridor that stretched beyond the office doors, where streams of students flowed like water, finding the path of least resistance. Marcus thanked her and stepped back into the current, allowing himself to be carried along with the morning rush. The hallways of Lincoln Valley were wider than those at his previous schools, with polished floors that reflected the overhead lighting and walls lined with trophy cases showcasing decades of academic and athletic achievements. The first thing Marcus noticed about his fellow students was their clothes: designer jeans, expensive sneakers, and accessories that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. This wasn't his first experience with wealthy schools, but the casual display of affluence at Lincoln Valley seemed particularly pronounced. Students clutched the latest smartphone models, wore watches that gleamed with genuine metal, and carried backpacks that looked like they belonged in high-end outdoor gear catalogs. Marcus's own appearance was deliberately unremarkable. His jeans came from a discount retailer, purchased during a back-to-school sale that his mother had planned weeks in advance. His sneakers were clean, but clearly well-worn, the kind of shoes that spoke of careful maintenance rather than frequent replacement. His backpack, a sturdy black model that had survived 3 different schools, bore the subtle signs of use that marked him as different from his more privileged classmates. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior of ordinariness lay something that none of his new classmates could have guessed. The loose-fitting hoodie hid shoulders that had been sculpted through years of intense physical training. His seemingly casual posture masked the heightened awareness of someone who had learned to assess threats and escape routes within seconds of entering any new environment. The calloused knuckles that he kept carefully concealed told a story of dedication and discipline that would have surprised anyone who bothered to look closely enough to notice them. Room 142 was exactly where the secretary had indicated, and Marcus slipped inside just as the first bell rang. Mr. Patterson, a tall man with graying temples and the kind of patient expression that marked experienced teachers, looked up from his desk with a welcoming smile. "You must be our new student," he said, consulting a roster on his desk. "Marcus Chen, I'm Mr. Patterson. Welcome to Lincoln Valley." The classroom fell silent as 28 pairs of eyes turned to examine the newcomer. Marcus felt the familiar weight of scrutiny, the way teenagers could dissect a new arrival within seconds and place them somewhere in the complex social hierarchy that governed their daily lives. He offered a polite nod to Mr. Patterson and scanned the room for an empty seat, hoping to minimize the attention already focused on him. The classroom itself reflected the school's affluent nature. Interactive whiteboards dominated the front wall, and each desk was equipped with a tablet for digital note-taking. Motivational posters featuring historical figures and inspirational quotes decorated the walls, creating an atmosphere that was both academic and welcoming. Large windows offered views of the campus courtyard, where late-arriving students hurried toward their first period classes. "Take any open seat," Mr. Patterson instructed, gesturing toward the back corner where a desk sat empty. As Marcus made his way through the rows, he caught snippets of whispered conversation. "New kid. Looks like another scholarship case. Wonder which school kicked him out." The comments weren't particularly malicious, but they carried the casual cruelty that teenagers often wielded without conscious thought. Marcus had developed thick skin over the years, learning to let such observations roll off him like water off a duck's back. He'd heard worse, much worse, and had learned that the best response was usually no response at all. He settled into the desk near the back corner, positioning himself where he could see both the teacher and the classroom door, a habit developed through years of needing to know his exit options at all times. The desk was slightly isolated from the main cluster of students, which suited Marcus perfectly. Isolation was safety, anonymity was armor, and invisibility was the closest thing to peace he could hope to find in the complicated ecosystem of high school. As Mr. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patterson launched into a discussion about the causes of World War I. Marcus allowed himself to observe his new classmates more carefully. The social dynamics were already becoming clear, even in the structured environment of the classroom. Near the front sat a girl with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer sweater that probably cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe. She took notes with the kind of expensive pen that served as much as a status symbol as a writing instrument, her movements precise and confident. Behind her, a boy with the broad shoulders and crew cut that screamed varsity athlete leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told that the world didn't revolve around him. His Letterman jacket hung on the back of his chair, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the collection of patches and pins that marked various achievements and affiliations. Scattered throughout the room were the supporting players in Lincoln Valley's social drama. The academic achievers sat attentively in the front rows, their notebooks already filled with color-coded notes, despite the class being only 10 minutes old. The social butterflies clustered in the middle, their desks positioned to facilitate whispered conversations that somehow managed to escape Mr. Patterson's notice. The artists and creative types had claimed desks near the windows occasionally, glancing outside as if drawing inspiration from the view. And then there were the ones Marcus recognized as kindred spirits, the quiet observers who, like him, had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming part of the background. A girl with short brown hair and paint-stained fingers sat 2 rows ahead, her attention focused entirely on her notebook, where she appeared to be sketching rather than taking notes. A boy with thick glasses and a nervous energy sat near the middle, his movements suggesting someone who was always ready to duck if attention turned his way. As the class progressed, Marcus found himself genuinely interested in Mr. Patterson's teaching style. The man had a gift for making historical events feel immediate and relevant, drawing connections between past conflicts and current world situations with a skill that kept even the most distracted students engaged. When he opened the floor for discussion about the factors that led to global warfare, hands shot up around the room with surprising enthusiasm. Economic competition between imperial powers, offered the blonde girl in the front, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being right. Nationalistic tensions in Eastern Europe, added the athlete, proving that he was more than just muscle and arrogance. Marcus listened to the discussion with growing respect for both the teacher and his classmates. Despite the obvious wealth and privilege that surrounded him, these students were clearly receiving a quality education. The level of discourse was sophisticated, the questions thoughtful, and the engagement genuine. It was a stark contrast to some of the schools he'd attended, where apathy and disruption had been the norm rather than the exception. When Mr. Patterson's gaze swept toward the back of the room, Marcus felt a moment of panic. The teacher's eyes seemed to linger on him, and for a terrifying second, he thought he might be called upon to contribute to the discussion. But Mr. Patterson simply nodded slightly, as if acknowledging Marcus's presence without demanding immediate participation, and continued with the lesson. The relief Marcus felt was profound. At his previous school, teachers had often put new students on the spot, either out of well-meaning attempts at inclusion or simple oversight. The attention that followed such moments was exactly what Marcus had learned to avoid. Mr. Patterson's restraint suggested either excellent instincts or extensive experience with transfer students who needed time to find their footing. As the period wound down, Mr. Patterson assigned reading from their textbook and reminded the class about an upcoming test on the causes and early battles of World War I. Students began gathering their materials with the practiced efficiency of teenagers who had mastered the art of being ready to move the instant the bell rang. "Marcus," Mr. Patterson called as students began filing out, "could you stay behind for just a moment?" The request sent a familiar spike of anxiety through Marcus's chest, but he nodded and remained seated while the room emptied. When they were alone, Mr. Patterson approached with a folder in his hand and the kind of expression that suggested this wasn't his first conversation with a new transfer student. "I wanted to touch base with you privately," he began, settling against the edge of his desk in a casual posture that was clearly meant to put Marcus at ease. "I've taught here for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of students transition into Lincoln Valley. I know it can be challenging, especially coming in during the middle of a semester." Marcus nodded, unsure of what response was expected, but grateful that Mr. Patterson seemed to understand the complexity of his situation without requiring detailed explanations. "Your transcript is impressive," the teacher continued, flipping through the folder. "Excellent grades, positive teacher comments, strong test scores. But I also notice you've attended 3 different schools in the past 2 years." The observation hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor judgment, but simply a statement of fact that suggested Mr. Patterson was more observant than many of his colleagues. Marcus had learned that teachers often fell into 2 categories when it came to transfer students: those who didn't bother to look beyond the surface, and those who cared enough to ask the difficult questions. Mr. Patterson clearly belonged to the latter group. "Sometimes families need to move," Marcus said carefully, offering the explanation that was both true and completely inadequate to explain the complexity of his situation. "Of course," Mr. Patterson agreed, his tone suggesting that he understood there was more to the story but wouldn't press for details. "What I want you to know is that this is a good school with good students, despite what you might hear about wealthy teenagers and their problems. Most of our kids are decent people who work hard and treat each other with respect." He paused, studying Marcus with the kind of careful attention that made it clear the next part of his speech was the real reason for this conversation. "That said, every school has its challenges. There are students here who sometimes forget that privilege comes with responsibility, who think their family's money or their athletic achievements give them license to treat others poorly. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need support, my door is always open." The offer was genuine, Marcus could tell, but it also carried an undertone that suggested Mr. Patterson had seen situations escalate before. The teacher was offering protection, but in a way that acknowledged his own limitations within the complex social dynamics of high school. "I appreciate that," Marcus replied, meaning it more than Mr. Patterson could possibly know. "I just want to focus on my studies and graduate without any drama." "That's exactly what I hope to hear," Mr. Patterson said with a smile. "Your next class is AP Chemistry with Mrs. Rodriguez, room 230, 2nd floor, East Wing. The staircase at the end of this hallway will get you there fastest." Marcus thanked him and headed for the door, but Mr. Patterson's voice stopped him just as he reached the threshold. "Marcus, for what it's worth, I think you're going to do just fine here. Sometimes the students who've seen the most have the best perspective on what really matters." The comment was cryptic but kind, and Marcus carried it with him as he navigated the hallways toward his second period class. The corridors were less crowded now, with most students already settled into their classrooms for the next period. The few stragglers moved with the urgent energy of teenagers who were cutting their timing close, and Marcus quickened his pace to avoid being late for his first chemistry class. The staircase was exactly where Mr. Patterson had indicated, and Marcus climbed to the second floor with growing curiosity about his next teacher. Chemistry had always been one of his stronger subjects, and he hoped Mrs. Rodriguez would prove to be as perceptive and supportive as Mr. Patterson. Room 230 was larger than the history classroom, with black-topped lab tables arranged in pairs throughout the space. The smell of various chemicals hung faintly in the air, mixed with the sharper scent of disinfectant that suggested recent cleaning. Safety equipment lined the walls, and a large periodic table dominated the space behind the teacher's desk. Mrs. Rodriguez was a small woman with graying hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that Marcus associated with teachers who had spent decades managing teenage chaos in environments filled with potentially dangerous chemicals. She looked up as he entered, consulted a list on her desk, and nodded toward an empty stool at a lab table near the middle of the room. "You must be Marcus. I'm Mrs. Rodriguez. Your lab partner is Lisa Kim. She'll help you get caught up on our current unit." The girl sitting at the table offered a shy smile as Marcus approached. Lisa was petite, with straight black hair, and the kind of intense focus that suggested she took chemistry very seriously. Her lab notebook was filled with detailed diagrams and color-coded notes that made Marcus's own organizational skills look amateurish by comparison. "We're working on molecular structures," Lisa explained in a quiet voice as Marcus settled onto his stool. "Mrs. Rodriguez likes us to build physical models before we start calculations. It helps with visualization." She gestured to a collection of plastic spheres and connecting rods that lay scattered across their lab table. The molecular modeling kit looked well used but comprehensive, with different colored balls representing various elements and flexible connectors that could simulate different types of chemical bonds. As Mrs. Rodriguez launched into a review of covalent bonding, Marcus found himself impressed by both the quality of instruction and the level of engagement from his classmates. This was clearly an advanced class, filled with students who had chosen to challenge themselves with difficult material. The questions were sophisticated, the discussions technical, and the expectations high. Lisa proved to be an excellent lab partner, patient with his questions and generous with her expertise. As they worked together to construct a model of a complex organic molecule, she shared insights about Mrs. Rodriguez's teaching style and expectations. "She's tough but fair," Lisa explained as they connected carbon atoms in a long chain. "She expects us to really understand the concepts, not just memorize formulas. The tests are challenging, but if you do the work and ask questions when you're confused, she'll help you succeed." Marcus appreciated Lisa's straightforward approach to both chemistry and social interaction. She seemed genuinely interested in helping him succeed rather than sizing him up for social status, which made her company genuinely comfortable. It was a relief to find at least one person who treated him like a normal student, rather than a curiosity to be examined and categorized. As they worked, Marcus became aware of conversations at neighboring lab tables that revealed more about Lincoln Valley's social landscape. 2 tables over, a group of students discussed weekend plans that involved expensive restaurants and exclusive parties. Behind them, another pair debated the merits of various colleges with the casual confidence of teenagers who assumed acceptance was simply a matter of choosing which elite institution they preferred. The wealth that surrounded him was casual and unconscious, woven into conversations like background music that these students no longer noticed. References to vacation homes, private tutors, and family connections to prestigious universities peppered their discussions with the kind of privilege that Marcus had encountered before, but never quite gotten used to. But there were also moments that reminded him that wealth didn't automatically translate to happiness or security. He caught fragments of conversations about intense academic pressure, family expectations that seemed impossible to meet, and social dynamics that were every bit as complex and painful as those he'd experienced at less affluent schools. When the period ended, Lisa helped him clean up their lab station with the kind of methodical attention to detail that Marcus had learned to appreciate in lab partners. As they put away the molecular models and wiped down their work surface, she offered some practical advice about navigating Lincoln Valley's academic expectations. "The workload here is pretty intense," she said as they organized the modeling kit pieces by color and size. "Most teachers assume we're taking multiple AP classes and participating in extracurriculars, so they coordinate assignment due dates to prevent total overload, but it's still a lot." Marcus nodded, filing away this information along with everything else he was learning about his new environment. The academic rigor was something he could handle. He'd always been a strong student, and challenging coursework was often a welcome distraction from social complications. But the mention of extracurriculars reminded him that high school was about more than just grades and test scores. "Are there any clubs or activities that are more welcoming to new students?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Usually, he avoided anything that might draw attention to himself, but something about Lisa's straightforward nature made him think she might offer honest advice rather than social manipulation. "Depends on what you're interested in," she replied thoughtfully. "Academic clubs like math team or science olympiad are pretty merit-based, so they don't care much about social status. The theater department is really inclusive if you're into performing arts, and there's a tutoring program that's always looking for volunteers." She paused, studying him with the kind of careful observation that suggested she was trying to read his interests and personality. "What did you do at your previous school?" The question was innocent, but it hit Marcus like a physical blow. What had he done at Riverside Academy? He'd tried to stay invisible, just like always. He'd focused on his studies and avoided social entanglements. He'd attended his classes, completed his assignments, and counted down the days until graduation. And then Tyler Morrison and his crew had decided that Marcus's very existence was somehow offensive, and everything had fallen apart in a matter of minutes. "I mostly focused on academics," he said finally, which was true enough without being complete. "I'm hoping to do the same here." Lisa nodded, apparently satisfied with his answer, and they gathered their books as the bell rang for third period. As students began filing out of the chemistry lab, she offered one final piece of advice. "Lincoln Valley has its problems like any school, but most people here are decent if you give them a chance. Don't let the wealth and privilege thing intimidate you. Underneath all that, we're still just teenagers trying to figure out who we are." Her words carried a wisdom that seemed beyond her years, and Marcus found himself genuinely grateful for her kindness. As he headed toward his third period class, he reflected on the morning's experiences and felt a cautious optimism beginning to take root. Maybe Lincoln Valley would be different. Maybe he could actually finish his senior year without incident. Maybe for once, he could just be a normal student focused on normal student problems, like college applications and graduation requirements. But as he turned the corner toward the English wing, Marcus nearly collided with a group of 3 boys who were walking with the kind of territorial confidence that immediately put him on alert. The leader was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of athletic build that spoke of serious training and the casual arrogance that often accompanied social dominance. His dark hair was styled with expensive product, and his clothes carried the subtle markers of serious money. Behind him walked 2 companions who clearly served as both audience and enforcers. One was shorter but heavily muscled, with the compact build of a wrestler or linebacker. The other was lanky and sharp-featured, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a smile that suggested he enjoyed watching other people's discomfort. Marcus's instincts, honed through years of reading social situations for potential danger, immediately categorized these three as predators. Everything about their posture, their movement, their casual invasion of space marked them as the kind of students who viewed the school as their personal territory and other students as either allies or prey. The leader looked Marcus up and down with the kind of calculated assessment that preceded either recruitment or elimination. His gaze lingered on Marcus's worn backpack, his discount sneakers, and his deliberately unremarkable clothes. The smile that spread across his face wasn't friendly. Well, he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to attract attention from passing students. Looks like we've got ourselves a new scholarship kid. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded trouble. He'd been at Lincoln Valley for exactly 2 hours, and already the pattern was starting. The targeting, the testing, the gradual escalation that would eventually force him to choose between fighting back and running away. But this time, Marcus told himself, things would be different. This time, he would stay invisible. This time, he would graduate without incident. This time, he would keep his secrets buried no matter what it cost him. The problem was that some secrets, once unleashed, can never be contained again. And some bullies, when they catch the scent of hidden strength, become absolutely relentless in their pursuit of forcing it into the open. Marcus was about to learn that sometimes the harder you try to stay invisible, the more visible you become to exactly the people you're trying to avoid. The boy who had spoken stepped closer, his presence filling the hallway like a storm cloud. Gathering momentum, Marcus could smell expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of athletic sweat, could see the way other students automatically created space around this trio without even seeming to notice they were doing it. This was clearly someone who was accustomed to commanding attention and respect through sheer force of personality and social positioning. "I'm Jake Morrison," the leader said, extending his hand in what appeared to be a friendly gesture but felt more like a test. "And you are?" Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind racing through the implications of this introduction. Morrison. He'd heard that name before, whispered in conversations at his previous school. Could this be related to Tyler Morrison, the boy whose face he'd rearranged at Riverside Academy? The boy whose father's threats had forced Marcus and his mother to pack up their lives and disappear into another fresh start. "Marcus Chen," he replied, accepting the handshake with careful neutrality. Jake's grip was firm, lasting just a moment, longer than necessary, as if he were testing Marcus's resolve or trying to establish dominance through such a simple gesture. "Marcus Chen," Jake repeated, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested he was filing away the name for future reference. "Where'd you transfer from?" The question was casual, but Marcus caught the sharp attention in Jake's eyes and the way his two companions had positioned themselves to block easy escape routes. This wasn't friendly curiosity. This was an interrogation disguised as small talk. "Chicago area," Marcus said, keeping his answer vague enough to be truthful without providing useful details. He'd learned over the years that the less information bullies had to work with, the harder it was for them to find pressure points. "Chicago, huh?" The shorter, muscular boy spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested East Coast origins. "I'm Derek, and this is Alex." He gestured toward the lanky boy, who offered a smile that didn't reach. His eyes, "What brings your family all the way out to California?" Alex asked, his tone conversational, but his posture predatory. "Dad get a job transfer? Parents going through a messy divorce? Or maybe you got kicked out of your last school?" The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to probe for weakness or vulnerability. Marcus recognized the technique from countless similar encounters over the years. These boys were fishing for information they could weaponize later, looking for the kind of personal details that could be twisted into ammunition for psychological warfare. "My mom got a job opportunity," Marcus replied, which was technically true. Dr. Chen had indeed received a job offer at Mercy General Hospital, though the speed with which she'd accepted it had more to do with necessity than ambition. "What kind of work does she do?" Derek pressed, his muscular frame shifting subtly closer, as if proximity might intimidate Marcus into revealing more than he intended. "She's a doctor." Wow! This information seemed to surprise the trio, and Marcus watched their expressions shift as they recalculated their initial assessment. A doctor's son didn't fit neatly into their scholarship kid narrative, which meant they'd need to adjust their approach. "Emergency medicine," Jake said, and it wasn't a question. "Dr. Sarah Chen, I heard my dad talking about the new hire at Mercy General." The casual mention of his father's connection to the hospital sent a chill down Marcus's spine. If Jake's family moved in the same social circles as the hospital administration, it meant they had both money and influence. It also meant that Marcus's carefully constructed anonymity might already be compromised. "Small world," Marcus said, neutrally, fighting to keep his expression calm, despite the growing sense that he was walking into a trap that had been set before he'd even arrived at Lincoln Valley. "Tiny world," Alex agreed, his sharp features arranging themselves into a smile that held no warmth, especially in a place like this. "Everyone knows everyone, and everyone talks to everyone. Secrets don't last long in a community where people actually care about each other." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. These boys had connections, resources, and the kind of social leverage that could make a new student's life miserable if they chose to deploy it. Marcus had encountered similar power structures before, but never quite so early in his tenure at a new school. "Speaking of community," Jake said, his tone shifting to something that might have sounded friendly to a casual observer, "we should show you around. Help you get oriented. Make sure you understand how things work here at Lincoln Valley." The offer was phrased as kindness, but Marcus's instincts screamed danger. This was the moment when predators typically revealed their true nature, when the friendly facade dropped and the real business began. He'd seen this exact pattern play out at Riverside Academy, at Westfield Prep before that, and at Jefferson High before his family's first forced relocation. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus said carefully, "but I don't want to be late for my next class." "What have you got third period?" Derek asked, stepping slightly to his left in a movement that looked casual, but effectively blocked Marcus's path toward the English wing. "AP Literature with Mrs. Thompson. Room 315, Alex supplied helpfully. "We'll walk you there. Wouldn't want you getting lost on your first day." The boys arranged themselves around Marcus with practiced ease, Jake taking point while Derek and Alex flanked him on either side. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a friendly escort, but Marcus felt like a prisoner being marched to sentencing. The hallways suddenly seemed longer, the other students more distant. The possibility of intervention or escape increasingly remote. As they walked, Jake maintained a steady stream of conversation that sounded helpful on the surface, but carried darker undertones for anyone trained to recognize the pattern. He pointed out important locations around the campus, identified key faculty members and their particular quirks, and offered advice about which classes to take seriously and which could be coasted through with minimal effort. "Mrs. Thompson is actually pretty cool," he said, as they climbed the stairs toward the third floor. "She's tough but fair, and she genuinely cares about literature. Just don't try to bullshit your way through her assignments. She can spot lazy work from across the room." The key to surviving her class Derek added, is understanding that she values original thinking over regurgitated analysis. She'd rather read a thoughtful interpretation that's completely wrong than a technically correct essay that just summarizes what other people have said. And whatever you do, Alex concluded with a grin, don't mention that you think Shakespeare is boring or outdated. She takes that personally. The advice was actually useful, which made Marcus even more suspicious about their motivations. Helpful bullies were often the most dangerous ones, because they established debt and obligation before revealing their true intentions. Every piece of assistance came with interest that would eventually need to be repaid. They reached room 315, just as the bell rang for third period, and students began streaming through the doorway with the practiced efficiency of teenagers who had long since mastered the art of rapid transitions. Marcus moved toward the entrance, but Jake's hand on his shoulder stopped him just short of the threshold. "Hey, Marcus," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate volume that excluded casual eavesdroppers. "We should grab lunch together. Today. There's a lot about Lincoln Valley that you'll want to understand, and we can help you navigate the social landscape." The invitation was phrased as an offer, but Marcus heard the command underneath. This wasn't a request. It was a summons. Jake Morrison and his crew had decided that Marcus required their attention, and refusing would likely escalate whatever game they were playing. "Sure," Marcus replied, knowing that agreement was the only response that might buy him time to figure out their angle. "Where should I meet you?" "Cafeteria, center table near the windows," Derek said. "You can't miss us." As Marcus entered the classroom, he caught Alex's parting comment, delivered just loudly enough to ensure he heard it. "This is going to be interesting." Mrs. Thompson's classroom was arranged differently from the previous two, with desks organized in a large circle that encouraged discussion and eliminated the traditional front-to-back hierarchy that many teachers relied upon. Bookshelves lined every available wall space, filled with volumes that ranged from classic literature to contemporary fiction to poetry collections that looked like they'd been well loved by generations of students. The teacher herself was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of intense eyes that suggested she saw literature as something approaching sacred. She wore a flowing scarf that gave her an artistic air, and her movements around the classroom carried the energy of someone who genuinely loved what she did for a living. "Welcome, Marcus," she said, as he looked for an empty desk in the circle. "We're just beginning our unit on American realism, starting with some Twain and moving through to more contemporary authors who wrestle with similar themes." Marcus found a seat between a girl with purple-streaked hair who was doodling elaborate fantasy creatures in her notebook margins, and a boy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. As he settled in, Mrs. Thompson launched into a passionate discussion about how Mark Twain used humor and satire to expose uncomfortable truths about American society. Twain understood that sometimes the only way to get people to examine their own prejudices and assumptions is to make them laugh first, she explained, pacing around the inside of the circle with infectious enthusiasm. He wrapped serious social commentary in entertaining stories, which made the medicine go down easier. A girl with perfectly styled hair raised her hand. "But isn't that kind of manipulative? Tricking people into thinking about serious issues by hiding them in funny stories?" "Excellent question, Miranda," Mrs. Thompson replied, her eyes lighting up with the kind of joy that teachers experience when students engage with difficult concepts. "Is it manipulation, or is it effective communication? What's the difference between persuasion and manipulation?" The question sparked a debate that revealed the intellectual depth Marcus had observed in his previous classes. These students were clearly accustomed to grappling with complex ideas and challenging each other's assumptions. Despite their wealth and privilege, they seemed genuinely committed to learning and growing. As the discussion evolved, Marcus found himself drawn into the conversation despite his usual preference for remaining invisible. Mrs. Thompson had a gift for creating an environment where ideas mattered more than social status, where thoughtful contributions were valued regardless of who offered them. When she asked the class to consider how contemporary media use similar techniques to influence public opinion, Marcus surprised himself by raising his hand. Social media platforms do something similar, he offered tentatively. They package political messages or social commentary in memes and viral content that people share because they're entertaining, not necessarily because they agree with the underlying message. Fascinating parallel, Mrs. Thompson said, nodding enthusiastically. Can you expand on that? How does the medium affect the message? As Marcus found himself explaining his thoughts about how digital communication had changed the way people processed information and formed opinions, he noticed that several of his classmates were listening with genuine interest rather than judgment. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln Valley, he felt like he might actually belong somewhere. The feeling lasted until the end of class, when reality reasserted itself in the form of his impending lunch appointment with Jake Morrison and his crew. As students filed out of the classroom discussing the reading assignment and debating points that had been raised during the discussion, Marcus felt the familiar knot of anxiety returning to his stomach. Mrs. Thompson stopped him as he gathered his books. Marcus, that was an insightful contribution to our discussion today. I hope you'll continue to share your perspectives with the class. Thank you, he replied, meaning it more than she could know. I really enjoyed the conversation. Literature is meant to be discussed and debated, she said with a smile. Books are just the starting point. The real learning happens when we wrestle with ideas together. As Marcus left the classroom, he carried Mrs. Thompson's words with him like a talisman against whatever was waiting for him in the cafeteria. The connection he'd felt during the literature discussion reminded him that high school could be about more than just survival. Sometimes, if he was careful and lucky, it could actually be about learning and growing and discovering who he was meant to become. But first, he had to navigate whatever game Jake Morrison was playing. The cafeteria at Lincoln Valley was unlike anything Marcus had experienced at his previous schools. The space was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the room with natural light and offered views of the campus courtyard, where students gathered around picnic tables and carefully maintained landscaping. The serving area looked more like an upscale food court than a traditional school lunch line, with multiple stations offering everything from gourmet salads to made-to-order sandwiches to international cuisine that reflected the diverse tastes of the student body. Marcus grabbed a turkey sandwich and a bottle of water, choosing simple options that wouldn't require much attention while he focused on reading the social dynamics around him. The center table near the windows was exactly where Jake had said it would be, and the three boys were already seated with trays that suggested they'd arrived early to claim the optimal position. As Marcus approached their table, he noticed how other students seemed to orbit around them like planets around a sun. Some stopped to exchange greetings or share brief conversations, while others simply nodded in acknowledgement as they passed. The deference was subtle but unmistakable. These boys commanded respect and attention from their peers. "Marcus!" Jake called out with enthusiasm that seemed genuine but felt calculated. "Glad you could make it. Sit down, join us." The empty chair they'd saved for him was positioned with his back to the rest of the cafeteria, which meant he couldn't observe the room while they talked. Marcus recognized the tactical disadvantage, but sat anyway, knowing that refusing would create a scene that might draw more attention than compliance. "How are your classes going so far?" Derek asked as Marcus unwrapped his sandwich. "Teachers treating you well?" "Everyone's been very welcoming," Marcus replied carefully. The academic standards seem high, but that's what I was hoping for. Academic standards, Alex repeated with a slight smirk. You sound like you're interviewing for college already. Aren't we all? Marcus countered, taking a bite of his sandwich to buy himself time to think. Senior year is pretty much all about college preparation. True enough, Jake agreed, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his own future prospects. Where are you thinking of applying? The question seemed innocent, but Marcus sensed undercurrents that made him cautious about revealing too much. College plans were deeply personal, tied to family finances, academic performance, and long-term goals that could all be weaponized by someone with malicious intent. I'm still researching options, he said diplomatically. My counselor at my previous school suggested I keep an open mind about different types of programs. Smart approach, Derek said, but his tone suggested he found Marcus's evasiveness notable. What are you interested in studying? Maybe engineering or computer science, something technical. This answer seemed to shift the dynamic at the table in ways that Marcus couldn't quite read. The three boys exchanged glances that carried meaning he wasn't privy to, and when Jake spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Engineering's a solid choice, lots of opportunities, good money, stable career prospects. He paused, studying Marcus with the kind of intensity that made it clear this conversation was heading somewhere specific. Of course, getting into a top engineering program is incredibly competitive. Grades, test scores, extracurriculars, recommendations, the whole package matters. Especially recommendations, Alex added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Teachers and counselors can really make or break an application with what they choose to include in their letters. The threat was subtle but clear. These boys had influence with faculty and administration, and they were letting Marcus know that his future could be affected by how well he played, along with whatever they had in mind. Letters of recommendation are definitely important, Marcus agreed, fighting to keep his voice steady, despite the growing realization that he was being recruited for something he probably didn't want to be part of. The thing about Lincoln Valley, Jake said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering an important lesson, is that success here isn't just about individual achievement. It's about understanding how to work within the community, how to build the right relationships, how to contribute to the culture that makes this place special. What Jake means, Derek clarified with a grin that held more menace than humor, is that there are certain expectations that come with being part of the Lincoln Valley family. Ways of doing things that have worked for generations of students. Traditions, Alex added, customs that help maintain the order and excellence that this school is known for. Marcus felt like he was being inducted into some kind of secret society, complete with coded language and implied obligations that he didn't understand but suspected he wouldn't like once they were made explicit. What kind of traditions? He asked, knowing he was walking into whatever trap they were setting, but unable to avoid it without creating a confrontation he wasn't ready for. The three boys looked at each other again, and this time their silent communication was followed by Jake pulling out his phone and scrolling through what appeared to be a photo gallery. When he found what he was looking for, he turned the screen toward Marcus with the kind of casual pride that suggested he was sharing something he considered genuinely impressive. The image showed a group of younger students, probably freshmen or sophomores, standing in what appeared to be the school courtyard. They were holding signs with messages that ranged from humiliating to degrading, their faces showing varying degrees of embarrassment and resignation. In the background, older students could be seen laughing and taking pictures of their own. Every year, we help the new students understand their place in the social hierarchy, Jake explained with the tone of someone describing a cherished family tradition. It's not mean-spirited or anything like that, just a way of establishing clear expectations and helping everyone understand how things work. Marcus stared at the image, his stomach churning as he recognized the dynamic he was being shown. This wasn't hazing in any traditional sense. It was systematic humiliation, designed to establish and maintain a power structure that benefited those at the top while keeping everyone else in line. Of course, Derek added with false casualness, the whole thing works because everyone participates. Older students who remember what it was like when they were new, and newer students who understand that paying their dues is part of earning respect. It's really about community building, Alex concluded, his sharp features arranged in an expression of mock sincerity. Everyone has a role to play, and when everyone understands their role, the whole system works smoothly. Marcus handed the phone back to Jake, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was being told and what was being asked of him. These boys weren't just garden-variety bullies looking for entertainment. They were running some kind of organized system of intimidation and control, and they were recruiting him to be part of it. What exactly would my role be? He asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. Well, Jake said with a smile that managed to be both friendly and predatory, that depends on what you're comfortable with and what skills you bring to the table. Some people are natural leaders, some are better at organizing and logistics, some have particular talents that can be useful in specific situations. What kinds of talents? Marcus pressed, though every instinct he had was telling him to find an excuse to leave this conversation immediately. Derek leaned forward, his muscular frame radiating the kind of physical confidence that suggested he was accustomed to using intimidation as a tool. Physical talents, for instance. There are times when new students need more direct forms of persuasion to understand their place in the community. Derek's being modest, Alex added with a laugh that held no humor. He's got a real gift for helping people see reason. Very persuasive conversational style. Marcus felt his heart rate beginning to accelerate as the true nature of what he was being recruited for became clear. These boys weren't just running a hazing operation, they were orchestrating systematic bullying with enough organization and sophistication to avoid consequences from administration, while maximizing psychological and physical control over their victims. And if someone doesn't want to participate? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer to that question as well. The silence that followed his question was heavy with implication. Jake's friendly expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes that reminded Marcus of predators he'd encountered in Chicago's roughest neighborhoods. "Everyone participates," Jake said finally, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that was somehow more threatening than shouting would have been. "One way or another, everyone finds their place in the community. The only question is whether they choose their role or have it chosen for them." "It's really much easier when people are cooperative," Derek added helpfully. "Less complicated for everyone involved." "Much less complicated," Alex agreed, his smile taking on an edge that made Marcus's skin crawl. Marcus looked around the cafeteria, suddenly seeing the social dynamics with new clarity. The way certain students seemed to shrink when they passed Jake's table, the nervous energy he'd noticed in some of his classmates, the careful deference that other students showed. To these three boys, it wasn't respect born of admiration. It was fear disguised as social convention. "I need some time to think about all this," Marcus said, standing up from the table with his half-eaten sandwich. "It's a lot to process." "Of course," Jake replied, smoothly, also standing. "Take all the time you need, but Marcus paused, already knowing he wasn't going to like whatever came next. "Don't take too much time. The community has expectations, and those expectations don't wait for people to get comfortable with them." As Marcus walked away from the table, He felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes following his movement across the cafeteria. Other students glanced at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity, and he realized that his lunch meeting with Jake Morrison hadn't gone unnoticed by the rest of the student body. He dumped his remaining food in the trash and headed for the library, needing a quiet space to think and plan. The conversation in the cafeteria had changed everything. Lincoln Valley wasn't going to be the fresh start he'd hoped for. It was going to be another battleground where he'd have to choose between becoming a victim or becoming something he'd sworn he'd never become again. The library was a sanctuary of quiet scholarship, with tall windows and comfortable seating areas that invited contemplation and study. Marcus found an isolated corner table behind the biography section, where he could think without being observed or interrupted. As he sat among the life stories of people who'd overcome impossible odds and achieved extraordinary things, he tried to make sense of his situation and his options. He could comply with Jake Morrison's expectations, participate in their system of organized cruelty, and buy himself safety at the cost of becoming part of something he despised. It would be the easy path, the one that led to acceptance and protection within Lincoln Valley's social hierarchy. He could resist openly, refuse to participate, and face whatever consequences Jake and his crew decided to impose. Based on what he'd observed and what they'd implied, those consequences would likely be severe and sustained until he either gave in or found a way to leave Lincoln Valley entirely. Or he could try to stay invisible, avoid confrontation, and hope they lost interest in recruiting him. But based on his experience with similar situations, predators like Jake Morrison rarely gave up once they'd identified a target. The harder he tried to hide, the more determined they'd become to flush him out. As Marcus sat in the quiet library, surrounded by stories of courage and perseverance, he thought about the choices that had led him to this moment. Every school had been the same pattern. Bullies identified him as either a threat or an opportunity, escalated their attention until he was forced to respond, and then everything fell apart in violence that followed him and his mother to the next town, the next school, the next attempt at a normal life. But maybe this time could be different. Maybe this time he could find a way to navigate the social minefield without losing himself or hurting others. Maybe this time he could just be a normal student who focused on his studies and graduated without incident. The problem was that Jake Morrison and his crew had already decided that Marcus Chen was going to be part of their story, whether he wanted to be or not. And based on everything he'd learned about predators and power dynamics, refusing to play their game was likely to escalate their attention rather than diminish it. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Master Liu's number. His former instructor in Chicago had become something like a mentor over the years, offering guidance that went far beyond martial arts technique. But as his thumb hovered over the call button, Marcus hesitated. Master Liu had been clear about the importance of avoiding situations where violence became necessary, and calling for advice would mean admitting that he was already walking down a path that might lead to exactly the kind of confrontation he was supposed to prevent. Instead, he opened his notebook and began writing, trying to organize his thoughts and assess his situation with the kind of analytical approach that Master Liu had taught him to apply to complex problems. Facts, options, consequences, and potential outcomes arranged in neat columns that made the chaos in his head seem more manageable. The facts were straightforward. Jake Morrison ran some kind of organized bullying operation. He wanted Marcus to participate, and refusing would likely make Marcus a target instead of an ally. The options were limited: comply, resist openly, or try to avoid the situation entirely. The consequences of each choice were predictable based on his previous experiences with similar dynamics. But as Marcus stared at his neat columns of analysis, he realized he was missing something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. Jake Morrison's system was hurting other students, younger kids who didn't have the training or experience to defend themselves. The photo Jake had shown him was evidence of ongoing abuse that was probably affecting dozens of students who had no recourse and no protection. For the first time since walking into Lincoln Valley that morning, Marcus began to consider a fourth option. Instead of focusing on avoiding confrontation or minimizing his own risk, what if he found a way to disrupt Jake Morrison's entire operation? The idea was dangerous and complicated, requiring careful planning and precise execution. It would mean abandoning his usual strategy of invisibility and putting himself directly in harm's way. But it might also mean protecting other students who couldn't protect themselves and stopping a cycle of abuse that would otherwise continue indefinitely. As the bell rang for fourth period, Marcus closed his notebook and headed for his next class with a new sense of purpose. He still didn't know exactly what he was going to do about Jake Morrison and his crew, but he was beginning to understand that doing nothing wasn't really an option. The afternoon classes passed in a blur of introductions and expectations as Marcus tried to focus on academic requirements while his mind churned through the social complexities that were already reshaping his senior year. His physics teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, was enthusiastic about hands-on experiments and real-world applications. His calculus instructor, Mrs. Park, had a reputation for challenging problems and high expectations. His final class, AP Psychology with Dr. Williams, promised to be particularly relevant given the interpersonal dynamics he was already navigating. By the time the final bell rang, Marcus had a clearer picture of Lincoln Valley's academic program and a growing appreciation for the quality of education he was receiving. Under different circumstances, he might have genuinely enjoyed the intellectual challenges and engaged deeply with the material. But the social landmine that Jake Morrison represented was casting a shadow over everything else. As students began filing out of the building toward the parking lot and bus loading zones, Marcus made his way to his locker to collect his books for the evening's homework assignments. The hallways were filled with the kind of casual conversations and social interactions that marked the end of another school day. But Marcus found himself analyzing every interaction for signs of the power dynamics that Jake had revealed during lunch. He was closing his locker when a voice behind him made him freeze. "Hey, new kid!" Marcus turned to find Derek standing behind him, no longer accompanied by Jake and Alex, but somehow more intimidating in his isolation. The muscular boy's presence filled the hallway, and Marcus noticed that other students were giving them a wide berth without appearing to do so consciously. "Derek," Marcus acknowledged, fighting to keep his voice calm despite the adrenaline that was already beginning to flood his system. "Jake wanted me to check in with you," Derek said, stepping closer in a way that forced Marcus back against his locker. "See how you're feeling about our conversation earlier." "Still thinking about it," Marcus replied, acutely aware that they were surrounded by other students, but somehow completely isolated within their own bubble of tension. "That's good," Derek said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thinking is important, but you know what's also important? Making decisions in a timely manner. The community doesn't like uncertainty, Marcus. People get nervous when new members take too long to figure out where they belong." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested Derek had given similar warnings before. Marcus felt his training beginning to assert itself, his body automatically shifting into a more balanced stance, while his mind catalogued escape routes and potential weapons. "I understand," Marcus said carefully. "How much time do I have to decide?" Derek's smile widened, and for a moment Marcus caught a glimpse of something genuinely dangerous behind the teenager's pleasant facade. This wasn't just a bully looking for entertainment. This was someone who enjoyed the process of intimidation and control for its own sake. "Let's say by Friday," Derek replied, his tone suggesting generous accommodation. "That gives you 3 days to observe how things work around here, ask any questions you might have, and make an informed decision about your future at Lincoln Valley. And if I decide I'd rather just focus on my studies?" Derek's laugh was genuinely amused, as if Marcus had made a particularly naive joke. "That's not really one of the options, Marcus. Everyone contributes to the community in one way or another. The only question is whether you choose how you contribute or let other people choose for you." With that, Derek stepped back and headed toward the exit, leaving Marcus standing by his locker with a racing heart and a growing certainty that his time at Lincoln Valley was going to be anything but peaceful. As Marcus gathered his books and prepared to leave the building, he noticed that several students were watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to sympathy. Word of his recruitment by Jake Morrison's crew had clearly spread through the social network that connected Lincoln Valley's student body, and he was already being categorized and judged based on associations he hadn't chosen. The walk to the parking lot where his mother would be waiting felt like a gauntlet, with every glance and whispered conversation potentially related to his changing status within the school's complex social hierarchy. By the time he spotted Dr. Chen's silver Honda, Marcus felt like he'd been at Lincoln Valley for weeks, rather than a single day. "How was your first day?" his mother asked as he buckled his seatbelt, her voice carrying the careful optimism that had become their ritual after each new beginning. "Challenging," Marcus replied, which was true enough without being complete. "The academic standards are high and the social dynamics are complicated." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding more than she said. After 3 forced relocations, they'd both become experts at reading between the lines of school experiences and assessing the likelihood of each fresh start becoming another disaster. "Any immediate concerns?" she asked as they pulled out of the parking lot, her question carrying the weight of too much experience with situations that escalated quickly. Marcus watched Lincoln Valley disappear in the side mirror and thought about Jake Morrison's recruitment speech, Derek's casual threats, and the photograph of humiliated younger students that was apparently part of some cherished tradition. "Not yet," he said finally, "but I'll keep you updated." As they drove through the affluent neighborhoods that surrounded Lincoln Valley High School, Marcus made a decision that would change everything that followed. Instead of trying to avoid Jake Morrison and his crew, instead of hoping to stay invisible until graduation, he was going to find a way to protect the students who couldn't protect themselves. He just had to figure out how to do it without destroying his mother's career, his own future, or the carefully constructed life they'd built from the ashes of their previous disasters. The problem was that some fights, once started, take on a momentum of their own, and some secrets, once revealed, can never be hidden again. Marcus Chen was about to discover that sometimes the only way to avoid becoming a monster is to face down the monsters that others have become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.